that recording?
Is it red? Yeah, it's recording.
Okay, all right. Okay, hi everybody. Welcome. This is Decoupled Drupal across the stack. If you're looking for RFPs or something else, you're not in the right room. I'm just going to ask because I think there will be some stragglers coming into the room. If you have an empty seat, if you're on this side of the room and you have an empty seat to your left, please scoot over one just so that we can leave these aisle seats open for people who are coming in late. Thank you very much. And this is a great opportunity to meet your neighbors and say hi. All right. So, first of all, just to set the stage here, I just want to get a sense of the room and figure out who we all are. I know it's after lunch, so we're not going to be very sleepy, but how many people here are new to Drupal? Great. Okay, a couple of us. How many people have never heard the term decoupled Drupal before in this room? Wow. Okay. All right. How many people have already built a decoupled Drupal build? Okay. All right. I see a few familiar faces in here, so that's good. And how many people are not Drupal developers? Site builders, evaluators, content editors. Okay, good. So my hope is that this session will have something for everybody. This is the Acquia session of MidCamp, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what decoupled Drupal is, why it's so important to us, what you should know about it, and finally, most importantly, how Acquia enables you to succeed with decoupled Drupal. So, how many people, by the way, were at my talk 2 years ago here at MidCamp where I discussed decoupled Drupal? Okay, a few of you. Okay, great. Some of that content will be repeated here, but it's actually been updated quite a bit. So you'll see a lot of changes from that content. Well, welcome to all of you. Who am I? I need to get out of the light here. Who am I? My name is Preston. I am the Director of Research and Innovation at Acquia. I work on the Office of CTO, which is a team of people that is tasked with working on Drupal itself and also mapping out sort of future roadmap stuff for Acquia as well. So I run our Acquia Labs team, which is our innovation department at Acquia, and I'm also the lead subject matter expert and kind of evangelist for decoupled Drupal at Acquia. I've also been a contributor to Drupal for many years now. I built my first Drupal site in 2007, went to my first Drupal camp in 2008, and I've been involved in Spark since that point, and also spoken a lot about these kinds of topics. So there's a hashtag here if you want to use it. There's my email, there's my Twitter, and we'll go ahead and get started. But first, just to give you a little bit of an idea of what it is that I do and my other half of my job, I also manage our Acquia Labs team, which is our elite team of engineers that works on innovative projects that push the envelope. So if you're looking at futuristic ideas and you're looking for that expertise, that's deep expertise in Drupal and emerging technologies, and you don't have that sort of expertise in-house, please come and talk to me. Labs would love to talk and see if we can figure out a way to help. Here's what we're going to cover today. Unfortunately, I am going to be very forthright and say that I worked my local this morning, so I do not have demos of Ember and React to show you today. I was hoping to do that, but during lunch I wasn't able to actually get that to work. So I will be showing you, however, some videos as well as one or two small demos. So I do apologize that a live demo will not happen in the way that I was hoping to. We're going to start off with what decoupled Drupal is. For those of you who know what decoupled Drupal is, this is probably going to be old hat for you. I want to talk very quickly, though, after that point, about the decoupled Drupal ecosystem, what it is in the Drupal community that we've built, what it is that's really powerful in Drupal in terms of our tools and all the things that we've done in terms of API first and in terms of all of the projects that many people have contributed to in the community. How do those help out with our decoupled Drupal builds? I want to talk briefly about our ecosystem at Acquia, known as Waterwheel, which is our sort of SDK ecosystem for Drupal. And then I'm going to jump right into topics that are a little bit more advanced, which relate more to what you actually want to be using when you decide to start building a decoupled Drupal project. Namely, web services distributions, otherwise known as API first distributions. If you don't know what a Drupal distribution is, I'll talk about that. And then I also want to talk about how, if you're building a Node.js stack and you have your JavaScript application that's using universal JavaScript, Angular, Ember, React, how might you bring that onto an infrastructure that works for you, namely Acquia Cloud? And I'll just illustrate some of those things using our cloud platform. Finally, I want to delve into just a couple of really interesting case studies that you may or may not have heard of, which are very compelling examples of decoupled Drupal that we've built at Acquia. And then finally, I'll just kind of talk briefly about the future of the decoupled Drupal stack and what that looks like. There's a couple of seats here. Please feel free. One of the things I hate the most when I give a talk is seeing people standing or sitting on the ground because, oh man, it's just because I've been in that position before too. So please don't be shy. If you want to yell out anything or ask me a question at any point, just stop me and raise your hand. This is meant to be a little bit more free, and I don't want this to be just a sort of one-way thing. So let's go ahead and dive right back into decoupled Drupal. And I want to just kind of give a really kind of basic conceptual introduction again. A lot of these topics you've probably already seen before, but simply put, this is the way that decoupled Drupal works, right? Generally speaking, you have what's called a consumer application, some kind of other client or some kind of an other architecture that is consuming content from your Drupal site. Now, generally speaking, there's two kinds of flavors of Drupal that can be used in a decoupled setting like this, and I'll talk about both. The first is a traditional website. Chances are that you've got an existing Drupal website, you're very happy with it, you've built stuff on PHP template or on Twig if you're on D8, and you've got a site already ready. But you want to take that to the next level. You want to extend that site so that it sends content out to other applications and acts simultaneously as a website and as a repository. That's one use case for using Drupal as a decoupled backend. But the other one is you might just want to use it as a repository. You might just want to use it as a very slim content management solution for your users, for your customers that you're building websites for. And if you're building a web application, for example, or a mobile app that's going to consume your content from Drupal, you want to be able to give them the opportunity to do that with a CMS that they can control the content in. So this probably is a lot of stuff on here that you already know about, but the most fundamental pieces on this are that there's a REST API, otherwise known as a web service, that basically serves as that exposure of content that allows for other applications to retrieve that content and also manipulate it. You can also think of it as kind of an interface, right, which allows for anyone to communicate with Drupal regardless of what language it's written in or what technology it's built in. On the other side, on the consumer side, you have an HTTP client, which basically accepts those responses from the server. So if you think about it, one way to think about this is that you have a server-client divide right here. On this side, you have the server. On this side, you have the client. And of course, you have HTTP requests and responses going back and forth. For those of you who've seen my other talks, I've used a metaphor from The Martian to describe this. And if you're interested in looking at that metaphor, it's a talk that I've given called Introduction to Decoupled Drupal. But simply put, decoupled Drupal is the use of Drupal as a content service for consumption and manipulation by other applications. Simply put, we're trying to expose Drupal content so that it can be used and changed by other systems. That's really the kind of simplest definition of decoupled Drupal. And it can be used to back things that run the gamut from your mobile application, your Android app, to your Angular application in JavaScript, to even things like a VR interface, or even things like digital signage. Or you could even serve it to a Raspberry Pi. And those things do happen quite a bit. But the thing that really allows for Drupal to expose that content and to provide the means for other people to consume that content are web services. You can use the core REST API. You can use JSON API, which is another REST API that's available as part of the Drupal contributed ecosystem. Or you can use GraphQL, which is not a traditional REST API, but is a web service that allows for Drupal consumers to consume content. If you're a little overwhelmed by these terms here, I'm going to explain them very shortly. Everyone with me so far? Good to go? Okay. So we all know what monolithic Drupal here looks like. It's just Drupal as an end-to-end system. It's not decouplable because you have your Drupal front end that's part and parcel of your Drupal architecture, which means that when you're building your Twig templates and you're building your Drupal front end, that is something that you can't actually separate easily, let's say, from the rest of the Drupal architecture itself, the Drupal monolith that exists. So what is the difference between monolithic and decoupled Drupal from an architectural standpoint? Well, as you can see here, in a decoupled setting, you have a decoupled application or a consumer application that is being written in a different language or a different technology, potentially, that has to accept this content using a REST API that mediates the relationship between Drupal and the consumer application. So me, as a consumer application, I'm going to ingest this data, put it into templates, and render it in my own way, rather than having Drupal go through the entire rendering process on its own and doing that by itself. So just to illustrate this very quickly, there's a lot of different things that you can build with decoupled Drupal as the backend. You can build a single-page application in universal JavaScript, meaning you have shared rendering code between client and server. You can also build a native Android application if you want to, which allows you to write a native mobile app. But the quintessential reason why people like to use decoupled Drupal as a unified backend is because you can use one single Drupal instance to serve content to all of your applications. So if you have an application ecosystem that has 3 JavaScript applications and 2 mobile apps, and you've got a Roku application thrown in there as well, and you've also got a Samsung TV application in there that also has to consume that content, you only need one single Drupal backend. And that single REST API that lies on top of your Drupal backend can serve content to all those consumers. A quick aside here. Now, a lot of you have probably encountered all 3 of these terms before. Decoupled, headless, API first. And there's a lot of different names that come into the mix here when you think about decoupled Drupal. So why is it that people refer to this as headless Drupal or decoupled Drupal or API first Drupal? There's a whole lot of churn right now happening in terms of terminology. The reason I prefer the term decoupled and why I know that Dries prefers the term decoupled is because headless has a very different definition and a very different connotation from decoupled. Simply put, if you look up the definition of headless software, it's basically software that does not have a graphical user interface or a traditional visual means of interacting with that software. As a user, that can mean many different things. One example, actually, of a headless Drupal interface is Drush or Drupal console, which are command line interfaces that don't have visual elements that you can use a mouse to click on, but do provide headless functionality that allows you to manipulate Drupal using a non-visual interface. So this is the reason why we prefer the term decoupled, because headless is a very loaded term and has a lot of different connotations, and it's a little negative as well. Actually, as a quick note, one of the most interesting stories I heard recently about somebody who was pitching a decoupled Drupal build to a client was a client that had recently also worked with a family that was had suffered a kidnapping in the Middle East. And so this is the reason why we want to avoid any connotations that might relate to the term headless. However, a lot of people do use headless as a term, and that is a very common thing. Yes?
I would think in many cases, I mean, it's also inaccurate to say headless because you're actually maintaining kind of the administrator interface through the web browser. I mean, in that sense, it's not headless in that sense too, right?
Exactly. Yeah, headless would mean that, it's kind of like a headless browser, right? I mean, there's no way to interact with headless Chrome, for example. Whereas with headless Drupal, you do have a way to interact with the, administrative front end. It's just not married to that front end. Yes.
You've been talking about Drupal basically being the data or content repository for some other front end, but of course Drupal also can consume external services and effectively act as a front end for other things. You're not discussing that today, right? You're talking about Drupal as the...
Well, it's a very good point, and I do actually, I'll talk about that briefly. So Drupal, yes, decoupled Drupal can also mean Drupal acting as the front end and not the back end, right? So for example, let's say that you have a commerce system. You're building something in Hybris or in Magento, and you're going to, or Salesforce even, right? Salesforce has an API, right? And you want to expose that data to Drupal so that Drupal can then ingest that Salesforce data, ingest that Hybris data, and basically forward that on to consumers. And this is a very common use case for large e-commerce shops that really want to be able to get content from a central commerce system, but marry that with a very good content system as well that allows for both of those things to be harnessed with equal power. I think someone had a question over here. Yes?
So it's not really inherent to the decoupled Drupal that it doesn't have any front end, it's just the way it's used, right?
And I'll repeat the question for the recording. So the question was, it's not inherent or intrinsic to the definition of decoupled Drupal that it serves as the front end. I would say that 95% or maybe 80% of cases that do use the term decoupled Drupal are going to be decoupled front end with a Drupal backend. However, there are cases where people have referred to decoupled Drupal in the sense of Drupal as the front end, commerce backend as the backend, or some other data backend being used.
They have it both ways? Like
Yes, absolutely. You can have a backend further back and also a front end in front of Drupal as well. That's something we see a lot as well.
Exact same not distribution, because the module composition might be different, but it's the same Drupal, right? The core is the same.
Yes, it can be. Yes. If you want to build it that way, yes, you can. You wanted to say, Matt, you want to say something?
So I'm really interested in this because, like you said, the back end with an e-commerce site, Drupal is the thin client between the back end of an ERP and then maybe a front end consumed elsewhere, like Google merchant feeds. So just because it's decoupled doesn't mean it's consumed by a JavaScript application. Mm-hmm. It's consumed by Amazon, Walmart.com Marketplace, Google Merchant Services. That Drupal then consumes feed from your SAP interface and then maybe your PIM, like Akenio. So that's, Drupal is the middleman.
I mean, to reduce it to like the very, sort of pure definition of what, you could, for example, argue that an RSS feed is, a decoupled front end for Drupal, right? If you were rendering an RSS feed into some kind of RSS feed viewer, there's a lot of flexibility here, and these terms are still being formalized and kind of solidified. So in the interest of time, I'm going to skip ahead here to just talk a little bit about why it is that people are so interested in this from the web development standpoint. We've talked about why people are interested in this from the commerce standpoint, from the mobile application standpoint, from set-top box applications. But what about JavaScript, right? Because that's really why a lot of people are looking at decoupled Drupal. Oftentimes, developers who are really well-versed in JavaScript have a little bit of a hard time understanding why Twig has so many Drupalisms in Drupal, because we have built a unique implementation of Twig that is a little bit distant from Symfony's Twig, and as a result, the Drupal front-end developer experience can be very challenging. And for a lot of development shops where you have a large population of JavaScript developers or people who are JS experts, it can make a lot more sense to decouple Drupal because you have that front-end expertise on this side that's knowledgeable about React or Ember or Angular or Vue, for example. So the JavaScript Renaissance was something that began with really, I would say, the sort of inaugural date of the Renaissance of JavaScript really begins with the release of Node.js, which unleashed this era of innovation in JavaScript, which allowed for JavaScript to be executed server-side. Now remember that JavaScript back in the day used to be kind of poo-pooed as this, play language that no serious developer really actually wrote in.
Sort of like PHP.
Sort of like PHP, exactly. Sort of like PHP, exactly. Or Ruby. I'm not going to talk about that. But as a result, a lot of these best practices in JavaScript have really changed. And for those of you who are more in the PHP realm these days or writing in other technologies and who are looking at where to expand next, you might want to consider looking at JavaScript today because there is a very robust set of best practices, robust standards, very robust documentation actually as well around ES6, which is the modern version of JavaScript available today, widely supported by many browsers, and also forms the underpinnings of this kind of phenomenon. So as a result of this new paradigm of using JavaScript on the server side, we are now able to write servers entirely in JavaScript. Now you're probably wondering yourself, what does that have to do with PHP and Drupal, right? Well, there's a key thing here, which is that you take a look starting in 2011 when Angular was released, 2012 when Ember really came into the fore, 2013 when React really first became very popular, and you start to notice that a lot of these client-side frameworks that were originally only on the client side are able to share their rendering code across the client-server boundary such that they can also be rendered on the server side. Now, I'm going to restate that because it's a very formative and very important sort of statement. If I have a React application on the client side, which gives me all of this interactivity and all of this flexibility and all of these nice user experience features, and the problem is that I have to wait 5 seconds on my browser for all of the code to initialize, for the JavaScript parser to go through, and that takes a long time. But if I can transfer a little bit of that rendering or all of that rendering over to the server side and flush to the browser an initial state of that application that already gives me markup, and all I have to do is perform bindings against that markup and rejuvenate that markup, rehydrate, as it were, that markup, that's a really compelling idea. Because there's a seat over here, by the way, if you want to. Okay. That's a really compelling idea, because that gets rid of all of the performance drawbacks of using JavaScript on the client side. So, universal JavaScript, which is this idea, it's also called isomorphic JavaScript, which is this idea of having the ability to repeat code or share code across client and server, was a very important phenomenon that occurred. And unfortunately, the very same phenomenon has not yet happened with PHP. There is no client-side PHP. There is no browser PHP that's in common use. I know that there are some prototype implementations out there. So what does this look like from the architectural standpoint? Well, the fundamental thing is that rather than having the JavaScript framework rendered into the Drupal page, right, and having Drupal serve out that initial state and then having JavaScript take that over, instead, we're actually executing, in this case, a JavaScript framework on the server side through Node.js. And Drupal will serve data to this Node.js server, and then that is what flushes out to the browser, is that fully rendered initial state of that JavaScript application. So, as a result of that, we get really rich user interactions, really rich interactivity on the page. We get dynamic rendering that occurs within a second. And it's not just those small-scale AJAX interactions, those small-scale asynchronous updates on the page, like a spinner or like a small message that appears. We're talking about entire sections of the page or the entirety of the page itself that is re-rendered on the fly dynamically in JavaScript. It's a really huge shift in our mentality. This is how it looks from a very bird's eye view. Node.js is going to execute a JavaScript framework, and in this case, Node.js houses the data as well, right? This is just illustrating the pure version of this. The framework on the server side is going to render that HTML. That's then flushed out to the browser, and now in Chrome, I have my site in Chrome. Now the HTML is loaded, the script tags are loaded, and all of the JavaScript framework is initialized again, and all of the bindings are performed, and now I have a fully fledged application in my client side, in my browser. Whenever it needs a new data update, whenever something goes out of date and it needs to fetch that new data, the framework will call back all the way to Node.js for that new information. Now, how does Drupal fit into this picture? Well, it's very simple. Rather than having Node.js and, say, MongoDB inside of Node.js serve out that data, instead, I'm going to have the JavaScript framework perform requests out to Drupal. And Drupal will respond with that data, give it back to the framework, and I still have my server-side framework execution. That renders out the HTML, once again flushes out to HTML. But the thing is that when I actually re-execute my JavaScript framework here, and I have some asynchronous requests that have to go back up to the server for updated data, that's going to go to Drupal instead. Right? That's typically how a lot of these Drupal plus Node.js builds work. Okay, so this is an example of fully decoupled Drupal. This is an example of Drupal not having any not having any involvement in the front end whatsoever. Drupal is completely out of the picture when it comes to the front end. Instead, Node.js is going to be fronting Drupal, and then JavaScript will be on the front in the client side. There is, by the way, I should mention, another paradigm as well, known as progressive decoupling, which is something that Dries brought up about 3 years ago, which involves basically the interpolation of a framework into the Drupal front end. So let's say that you're not ready to buy into this whole paradigm yet. Node.js is something that's still completely crazy. You can still have access to some of these interactive features as long as you are able to place that framework inside the Drupal front end, inside the native Drupal front end itself. And for some people, that is sufficient to enrich those user interactions or give that feel of the application enough. There's a lot of speaking I've done about progressive decoupling. If you'd like, I can send you some resources on that. So, Dries recently had a blog post about 3 months ago that is about how you should look at decoupling Drupal in 2018. I know this is very small, but there's a couple of things that you really have to ask yourself when it comes to deciding whether or not it's a good idea to go this route and to take Drupal way down this path, which is, what do you intend to build with Drupal? Are you building just one experience, or are you building multiple? Are you building just a website, or are you building a website plus a mobile app, plus an IoT app, plus a Raspberry Pi app, plus an Apple TV app, right? If the answer to that is going to be multiple, you have to ask yourself, first of all, is one of them a website? Because if it is, then you might want to use Drupal as that sort of simultaneous usage, as I mentioned before, both as the site and also as that exposer of data to other consumers. If not, and it's not going to be a website, you're only serving content to a bunch of applications that don't really need the Drupal front end at all, then you might want to use Drupal just as a repository only. So same thing on this side as well. If you know that that one experience that you want to build is a web application or a website, then you want to make sure that you are using Drupal for that. So the next thing that you want to ask yourself is, what are the things you can't live without? And this really ties into some of the risks and rewards and some of the pros and cons of decoupling Drupal. There's both sides of this that are worth considering. Not only the site builder and content editor experience, but also the developer experience. Because oftentimes, a lot of people I talk to who are exploring or building decoupled Drupal implementations are saying our developers really outweigh the editor's needs. And so you have to really balance and forge that kind of equilibrium between the two. Okay. Finally, this right here gives you an idea of, well, I know that most of my needs are developers, right? My JS team really needs this. Or I've got a lot of developers, but I don't really have much use for content editing features like layout builders or in-place editing or those kinds of things. In that case, you can go ahead and fully decouple. That makes perfect sense. But if you do have those needs, you might want to consider whether it's a good idea to decouple Drupal. Dries has a very good blog post on this, by the way. If you look for how to decouple Drupal in 2018, it's a really kind of comprehensive decision-making flow for you. Alrighty, so the decoupled Drupal ecosystem. What is it that's available to you now that you've decided that you want to go this path and you want to build decoupled Drupal architectures? What is available to you as a developer? Well, there's both core web services, as I mentioned, that provide a REST API. And there's also web services modules in general in Contrib that give you some of those features as well. And I'm going to just show this diagram just to give you an idea of the fact that there's a big difference between what's called a REST API that follows what are known as the fielding constraints, which really rely on this idea of REST serving as this application state machine, yada, yada, yada. It's a lot of academic stuff. GraphQL doesn't fit in that paradigm, right? GraphQL is non-RESTful. It does not follow those constraints. GraphQL is a web service because it does yield data and it does provide that sort of intermediation between the consumer and the server, but it is not a REST API itself. The core REST modules are really great because they allow you to basically expose any content entity that's in Drupal. And content entities in Drupal include things like nodes, users, taxonomy terms, and comments. And they allow for those content entities to be exposed as JSON. And you can either choose sort of the raw data structure JSON that's available, or you can choose what's known as HAL JSON, which is the HAL normalization of JSON. HAL is what's called hypertext application language, which is essentially a specification that adds onto the base layer of JSON. So if you want to do things like link data, have references to other documents or other resources that you want the client to be aware of, that's where you might want to use HAL. So for those of you who are familiar with like JSON LD as well, that's related to this. Views also, by the way, has what's called a REST export as a native display type. So if you're building a view out and you want to create a view that allows for any consumer application to take that view, ingest it, turn it into data that it can use in its own templates, that's what you can do with core REST. Just to illustrate very quickly what this looks like, just so you see what this actually is doing, what's happening here is that when you perform a request to Drupal, and some of these examples, by the way, might be a little bit out of date. I just realized I didn't go through and update these 100%. So these might be a little bit out of date. These routes might be wrong. I will correct these for the slides that do go out in a PDF. But essentially, that's not the important part. What's important is that when you perform a request against the core REST API, you're getting data back in return. Now, why am I showing you this? Because I want to illustrate the differences between core REST and some of the other flavors of web services that are available in Drupal, such as JSON API. For those of you who don't know this, JSON API is a specification that has been adopted by several large communities, such as Ember.js, Ruby on Rails, to power their APIs or to power their sort of ingestion of data. JSON API is a spec written, actually co-authored by a good friend of mine in New York. But the interesting thing about JSON API is that it provides a standard for relationships as well. So when you have references to other resources, other entities in your existing content entities, those are captured by JSON API. JSON API codifies the ability for you to be able to retrieve those additional relationships as well, those related entities that are attached as well. So just to give you an example of what that looks like, by the way, it also includes things like filter, sort, pagination, all sorts of things that you want to be able to do when you're manipulating data. And so one of the interesting things about the Drupal JSON API implementation is that we do have full pagination support, for example. So you can request only 10 articles, for instance, out of all the articles that you have. So what does this look like? Well, what this looks like is that when I go here and I want to include an additional field, because the author field in this case is a referenced entity. It's an entity reference field that is referring to an author node. And this author is right here, right? It's going to serve me all the information about that author, which is not housed in this entity. It's actually housed in this include, which is a related entity, but not part of the initial payload. So what that means is that if you were trying to do this in core REST, you would have to make 2 requests, right? And that's what that previous example showed, is that for me to get the name Joe and also the body of this article, I would have had to make 2 requests. JSON API obviates that necessity. All right, now there's also GraphQL. I've given several talks about GraphQL in the past. GraphQL is a really interesting web service because it allows you to perform fewer queries and actually define what you want on the client side from the server side. If that's confusing, let me just illustrate this with an example. When I perform a request against an article, and I say, I want this article, but I only want the title of that article. If I perform a request against the core REST API or JSON API, I'm going to get the title of the article plus everything else. But what if I only want the title? What if I'm building an application on Raspberry Pi or some low-level hardware that can only ingest a certain amount of data before it crashes out? In that case, I might want to actually define more narrowly what my data that I want to retrieve should be. So, in GraphQL, what happens is that the responsibility to serve the correct response or to provide the correct structure for a response is coming directly from the client, not from the server. The server is not the one that dictates what it is that gets sent to the client. The server publishes what's possible, but the client is going to publish its requirements. What does it need from the server in the structure that it wants? What this looks like is that if I only want the title of the article and the title of the author, who's the name of the author, and by the way, this is just illustrative. This is not how GraphQL works today, and I'm going to update this as well. But if you see this is an example, a very pure, simple example of how this works, which is that I don't get things like the node ID. I don't get things like the body of the article or the user ID of the author. All right, so I want to talk about Waterwheel, because Waterwheel is an interesting ecosystem that Acquia has been working on, and we're just beginning to ramp up more efforts in this area. But Waterwheel is our response to a lot of the other headless CMSs or decoupled CMSs that are out there. How many people have heard of Contentful or Prismic or Content Stack? Okay, so those providers have already taken over this market to a great degree. They've already known that this decoupled CMS paradigm is very important. And these competitors of Drupal and WordPress as well offer a series of SDKs for any developer of any application system or any kind of technology to be able to consume data from those respective backends. And so, for example, me as a Python developer, I can use the Python SDK that's been provided by Contentful to consume data from Contentful writing my native Python. Or if I'm an Objective-C programmer, God bless, then I can write Objective-C, consume the data from those places, and get what I need as well. So, just to give you an idea of what this looks like, what we're really talking about here is two different things, which is that we want to be able to provide the best developer experience on both sides of that server-client boundary. The way that we do that is by providing, number one, on the client side, SDKs, reference implementations, starter kits that allow people to get started very quickly. There's also API-first distributions and web services distributions, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But these kinds of things really improve that Drupal developer experience from the consumer standpoint, right? We're not talking about Drupal developers who are writing PHP. We're talking about developers who only want to use Drupal because they're writing a JS application that needs some content. So a good developer experience in this regard must mean that it's easy for those consumers, those people who are writing those applications, to work with those APIs that Drupal has provisioned, as I mentioned just previously. So SDKs can really make it good to help developers out. And also starter kits, these reference implementations where you can just take what's there and build on top of it, is a really great way to get started with Drupal. And there's a couple of projects that really do this very well. They're actually part of what we call the Waterwheel ecosystem. There's, by the way, another ecosystem that's very similar to this that I'll talk about in a little bit as well. But Waterwheel is Acquia's own kind of SDK ecosystem. So we currently have SDKs available for JavaScript and for Swift, which means that if you're building a React application or an iOS application or a watchOS, tvOS application, you can use the Waterwheel Swift SDK. If you're building a React application or, let's say, a Vue application, you might want to use Waterwheel.js. So Waterwheel is really meant to be a translator for developers in those technologies, right? Waterwheel helps those non-Drupal developers who don't know anything about Drupal and only want to get that content out of Drupal and give their clients something that they can use to edit that content. Those non-Drupalists can now speak Drupal. They can communicate with Drupal in a very easy way. So Waterwheel.js, for example, is a really cool SDK that I built the first version of and has now been has undergone several releases that allows for these developers to consume and work with this content without ever having to learn Drupal, learn PHP, learn how the REST API works. How does that work? Well, first of all, if you want to set up Waterwheel.js, it's very simple. You go to the Git repo, clone it. You've got your installation and PMI. You've got your test. You can run your tests to make sure things are working properly. And then finally, to go ahead and create the client bundle. Now, to use this in Node.js, and this is really interesting, Waterwheel.js is unique. Not unique. It's not unique. It's great because it allows for you to use it either on your Node.js server on the server side or in your application on the client side in React, right? If you want to do this in Node.js, all you have to do is go ahead and instantiate a new Waterwheel, create a new instance of Waterwheel, give it all of the sort of OAuth authentication, and I'm afraid I'm not going to be covering authentication today, but at some point, by the way, just a quick aside, one thing I've been working on over the last couple of weeks has been a new column at dev.acquia.com. It's called Experience Express, and if you're interested in anything related to core REST, how to work with Decoupled Drupal, how to use Drupal, how to build React applications based on Drupal, please follow that column on dev.acquia.com. I will be posting every single week. Actually, in a couple of weeks, I'm going to be talking about authentication, so you can go ahead and bookmark that, and I'll make sure to let you know when that's out. Next week, I'll be talking a little bit about the core REST module and the serialization API. So, anyways, so what you want to do is you want to give it the base URL, your OAuth information, your OAuth credentials, and so on and so forth. In a browser, however, it becomes very different. Of course, in this case, we have a browser that supports ES6. This const keyword, by the way, is an ES6 feature. ES6 being the new version of JavaScript that is now widely supported in evergreen browsers. Now, this is where we get to the good stuff. So if you're a JS developer, this is really awesome because I have a promise that is going to give me a promise. Yes, I have a promise that's going to give me the Drupal data response. And guess what? I don't have to look at a single line of PHP. I don't have to look at a single URL of Drupal. I don't have to look at anything related to Drupal at all. All I have to do is perform a GET request within my native JavaScript. That's really cool.
Why is there a number 1 there?
That in that case, that is the user ID. So this is fetching. Sorry, I should have made that clear. This is fetching the user with the user ID of 1. So the first user.
Okay. I assume there's like a node get.
Yes, there is a node get. Yeah, actually, if you go to this page right here, this first link, it'll give you all of the documentation, all of the methods that you can invoke to get whatever you need out of the Waterwheel API. There's also a bunch of other stuff. As I mentioned, there's Waterwheel Swift, which is written by Kyle Browning, who's probably the biggest booster of iOS and Apple OS stuff in Drupal. We also used to have, and I should have deleted this actually, a deprecated module called Waterwheel. This is actually deprecated, so this is now actually part of the Open API module. And then we also have some reference builds for you. This is Ember Drupal Waterwheel is an Ember CLI add-on. So if you're an Ember developer and you want to use your native Ember CLI to do some data requests to Drupal, you can do that here. Then there's, to scaffold a Drupal application, for example, scaffold the adapter that you want. Also, there's 2 references that we've built, one for Ember and one for React. And so those are both really good starting points if you want to look at how you can go ahead and work on a foundation that already exists to build these things. Okay, I'm running out of time here, so I want to talk a little bit about web services distributions or API-first distributions. So, by the way, a distribution in Drupal is basically a different flavor of Drupal, simply put. Instead of having the core installation of Drupal, which gives you a certain set of modules that you're just stuck with, distributions will give you a different set of modules, a different set of configurations that allow you to have a bit more flexibility. A very good example of a distribution that's very popular is, for example, OpenY, which is what YMCAs use. There's lots of other ones, right? There's the conference distribution. I mean, I can go for hours about this, but distributions are important because we want to enable developers who solely want to use Drupal as that data repository, nothing else, right? We're not worried about the site, we're not worried about Twig or PHP template. We just want to get those APIs and that content out. In that case, a good developer experience must mean that we have to be able to give them tools that allow them to use Drupal easily to get their content out. So what's an example of this? Well, these web services distributions have become very common in recent months in the Drupal community and have very active and very large communities behind them. Mainly Contenta actually has a very, very active community behind it. And these distributions are intended for developers to be able to consume Drupal and consume that data in a very easy way by provisioning those APIs and by setting up Drupal in a way that it can provide that data. So these 3 are Reservoir, Contenta, and Headless Lightning. Now, I don't have time to go through all 3 of them, but I do want to talk about each of them briefly because they are really interesting to take a look at, especially from the standpoint of anyone who's interested in looking at how Drupal can be customized to serve very different use cases. In the case of Contenta, Contenta is a content API and CMS backend. It's really focused on the JSON API use case. If you're building something based on JSON API, Contenta is the way to go because it has a great amount of features. It includes the JSON API extras module, for example, which extends the JSON API availability, the sort of available features there. Really, really great to use if you're only using Drupal as a content repository. This is not for building websites. Let me just make that clear. These are not for building websites. These are for building content repositories, right? Reservoir, meanwhile, is a backend for your front end. It's really meant to be an austere flavor of Drupal. It's meant to be something that is much more simple, and actually one of the biggest complaints that we often get is there's no view support. That's by design, because when it comes to a developer, when they encounter the Views UI, If you're an Apple OS developer or you're a JavaScript developer and you look at the Views UI, you're like, what the heck is this? Like, what is this stuff, right? We want to avoid that. We want to give them the most simple and just down-to-earth, easy-to-use thing possible. So, what does that look like? Well, I'll show you right now. So, this is a screencast. By the way, I just realized this morning I tried to install Reservoir. There is something borked. I think there's some dependency issues in terms of versioning. If you try to install Reservoir right now and you can't get it to work, that's probably a bug that we're already aware of. So, but I'm just going to go through this right here, and I'm going to talk against this. Uh-oh. All right, Wi-Fi, come on. This is the co-author, by the way, of the distribution, Wim Leers, talking about some of the features. But I'm going to just kind of talk through this myself. So right now what Wim is doing is he's going ahead and acquiring and using Composer to install a new Reservoir on his computer, right? So this is going to get all the dependencies. I'm going to go ahead and just kind of fast forward here a little bit. Now what happens is when you, or you know what, I'll just let this play because this is really good. Now when you go into your Reservoir local, you get the familiar Drupal installation. It's very easy, right? And it sets up your, you can set up a database that's the back. It's just like the normal Drupal installation process. So you're thinking to yourself, what's the big difference here? What is so different about Reservoir versus Drupal? And by the way, this is the same kind of way that Contenta and Headless Lightning both work, right? And so right now he's just filling in all this information, doing all this stuff. Now, when you actually get to this point, you get a welcome tour, which is one of the biggest things that can be of a huge help to developers. You get an idea of what it is that this can do. And as you can see, the toolbar has completely changed over. There is no more Appearance tab. There is no more Extend tab. We're not giving people the ability to create a website. We're giving them the bare essentials of what they need to create a content service. So you've got your content modeling interface, you've got your API provisioning, you've got your content itself that you want to have your editors build. But fundamentally what's happening here is that we're giving this as a tool for editors and developers, but not for people who are building websites. As you can see here on the right side, we have a preview of what this will look like ultimately when you consume it via JSON API. And as you can see, there's the raw version there. Now, this is really cool because you can see side by side a preview of the sort of the content as well as the JSON API preview. And that, by the way, is something that's now present in Contenta as well. And with these documentation, with the generated documentation that's available through OpenAPI in Reservoir and also now in Contenta, I believe, you can actually go through and browse and look at these methods and actually very clearly have an understanding of what the data structure looks like on the front end and what, as a developer, you need to know about, right? So I know, for example, that when I perform a get, I have to look at, for example, this key and this value to get what I need, right? And then you've also got authentication as well. And you can, this is how you get to the point where you can get an OAuth token. By the way, I'm sorry I can't cover authentication today. It is a very important issue. I encourage you to, once again, follow that column so I can share all of the information that you need on authentication with you. We also have users and permissioning, you know, all the stuff that is already in Drupal. Anyways, I want to stop here because we are a little bit short on time and jump right back in here. So next, Headless Lightning is a flavor of Lightning, if you're familiar with Acquia Lightning, which is a distribution for Drupal websites that we build at Acquia. Headless Lightning is kind of the headless flavor of that. So there's two options if you want to use Acquia tools to get your decoupled Drupal builds going. The community supported one, and the one that really has a lot of energy behind it is Contenta. Is Contenta, and they also, by the way, have their own library of SDKs as well that you can use. So we've heard from a lot of people about issues around decoupled Drupal in the form of what sorts of things people want to build, right? We heard this at Acquia, and we said, you know what, we really do need to provide people the ability to not only build really compelling decoupled Drupal architectures, but also decoupled Drupal infrastructures. What we learned from talking to a lot of our customers is that people really want those application-like experiences that really only occur in JavaScript these days. And we also wanted to make sure that you have a permissioned backend, you have a content backend, a data backend that really gives you and your editors the peace of mind that you want. But most of all, what people really want these days is a single manageable code base, or a single manageable repository, or a single manageable set of code that is easy to manage and gives you everything that you need right there, both the server side and the client side. Acquia has a solution to this, which is our platform for Decoupled Drupal. Regardless of whatever it is that you're building, we have the solution for you. Namely, if you're building a Drupal site, we got you. I mean, this is what our bread and butter is, obviously. And of course, the other sponsors here as well, Pantheon, Platform SH. We all specialize in Drupal, and we all specialize in awesome websites. If you're building a native application, you can still use what's available in the Acquia platform by using things like our web services that are available. And we don't have that hosting available to you, but you can use something like Heroku, for example, to host those applications. But if you're building a JavaScript application that's built on Node.js, that's got a backend that's written in server-side JavaScript, and you want to be able to host that with Acquia, we have just, in the last 6 months, released our new product, which is Acquia Cloud Node.js hosting. And now, if you want to build a Drupal site and also have a Node.js application in front of that, plus your your whole architecture that is built on decoupled Drupal and JavaScript, you can host all of that on one single vendor at Acquia. How many people are Acquia customers in the room, by the way? Okay, so a lot of you have seen this before, which is our Acquia Cloud user interface, which allows you to basically move across elements and take code and deploy it and really kind of do a lot of different things that you might want to do with your Git repository. The most interesting thing that is on this screen, however, is the fact that you've got all of these environments and you've got your ability to deploy a particular commit of code. With Node.js, that's a little bit different because, first of all, you have the ability to set environment variables. Node.js is a little bit different in that it's not part of that same kind of dev stage prod paradigm, but you can actually provide environment variables, and you can also deploy Node.js by using build artifacts. Build artifacts are really kind of the elements that you would deploy. They're not like traditional commits, but they are essentially versioned forms of your Node.js application that you can deploy to your Node.js environments. Now, what's interesting here is that I can select any build artifact in the same way that you can select a git commit from your history, and you can go ahead and deploy that to whatever environment you want to with our Node.js platform. And of course, one of the most important things of any cloud platform, is that you must have an ability to manage your teams, manage your permissions, manage whoever is going to be able to touch those applications and impact your infrastructure. So why would you want to look at Acquia Cloud for hosting your entire decoupled Drupal architecture and your whole stack? Well, the reason why is because Acquia is really the only provider that allows you to take one platform, one contract, one SLA, one vendor, a one-stop shop for both Node.js and Drupal. So if you're building any sort of JavaScript application that relies on data coming from the Drupal website, host both those things on Acquia Cloud. We've got great support for both. We've got high availability, security, and performance at the same level that we provided for Drupal. And also, we've got things like Acquia pipelines, which allow you to do things really richly in terms of the DevOps perspective when it comes to both Node.js and Drupal. So, all things said, Acquia Cloud really is the best place to host your decoupled Drupal stack. So what I want to do is I want to show you very quickly in a tour of the UI, and of course I've been logged out, which is of course the thing that always happens. Now, if I really hope that this doesn't ask me for good, no two-factor, good. Well, I have to whip out my phone here. So, as you can see here, this is a normal Drupal site. There's dev stage prod. Obviously, Acquia Cloud has on-demand environments, so you can have an arbitrary number of environments here if you want. But the most important thing here that I think is important to look at is that you've got your ability to choose the branch that you want to, or your commit hash that you want to provide to your deployment, so that a particular thing goes out into your prod or your dev environment or your stage environment, right? So, this is kind of interesting because when you actually take a look at this, one of the new things is that we actually now flag all of our applications with either Drupal or Node.js. So when I actually switch over to my Node.js application here, what you'll see is now I've got my Node.js environments, and I can also switch the code here and deploy. I'm not going to do, because this is a demo application that other people are using, so I don't want to deploy anything. But as you can see, I can find any artifact that I want to here and deploy that to my environments. And as you can see, this kind of parallelized approach as part of this unified whole is really powerful, because now you only have one place that you have to go for both your Node.js hosting and your Drupal hosting. So that's really cool. And that's the sponsored portion of this talk, by the way, in case you were wondering and not really sure what was going on. Okay, so finally, what I want to do, and I'm sorry I had to skip that section because I got stuck. A couple of case studies really quickly. First of all, who's heard of the New York City subway? You've probably heard a lot of bad things about it. If you've ever been to the New York City subway in the last month or two, you've probably seen a lot of these new countdown clocks appear. And you've probably heard about them being pretty buggy. The truth is that the state government agencies can be very bureaucratic, as we've learned. But we actually, at Acquia, built a very compelling implementation for the MTA that uses Drupal as that manager that's responsible for serving content and information to every single countdown clock in the New York City subway system. This is a system that has over 400 stations, and every single one of those is going to have a countdown clock that is talking to Drupal via Angular. It's really, really cool. You don't see any news tickers here, but the news ticker, for example, is taken from Drupal content that MTA editors actually input into the system. And it's an incredible interface on the back end. I mean, you have access to every single station. You can see what's going on there. And this is all coming from that kind of live, real-time feed that MTA provides. So really cool stuff. And we can talk about that more afterwards. And then Princess Cruises, if you've ever taken a cruise before and you've always been wondering how is it that a lot of these cruise liners have the ability to kind of show me content everywhere and show me the things that are personalized for me everywhere. Princess Cruises has a very rich array of channels that it uses to reach its customers on board its cruise liners. For example, there's a mobile app, there's digital signage, there's a tablet application as well, all of which are served content from Drupal and served data from Drupal. There's 120 digital signs, a whole lot of stuff in there. There's a lot of interesting information about Princess Cruises on the Acquia website if you're interested, and we can talk more about that as well. So I want to finish up here. I know that we're out of time, but one of the biggest things I want to have everyone take away is, yes, Acquia is great, Acquia Cloud is awesome, but that's not the only value you're going to get from this session. I want to also instill in this group that we are encountering right now and in the midst of a very fundamental shift in the way that we think about software architecture. And this is true everywhere you look. If you look at things like the blockchain and Bitcoin, if you look at things like Drupal and microservices, if you look at other elements of software, there is a wholesale move away from centralized monolithic architectures. Not just because it's more convenient for developer teams and more manageable, it's because the idea of actually decoupling exposes a lot less surface area for things like security risks. It exposes more developers to more of their tools that they can use, that they want to use. And of course, it is really the way that a lot of our omni-channel world is going to be in the future. We're no longer going to have that kind of an idea of a single monolith. But once again, decoupled architectures do mean these kinds of platform challenges, infrastructural challenges. So how do we face those? Well, number one, Acquia Cloud is that one-stop solution for a decoupled Drupal from end to end, meaning decoupled Drupal plus Node.js, host it all on Acquia Cloud, and you're good to go. But as architectures become more and more decentralized in the sense of there's no longer that monolith that really is that one single place where everything is housed, we're seeing a little bit more centralization infrastructure, and that's really what Acquia Cloud is doing. We're trying to provide the means for you to be able to host everything that you have on one place. Because, frankly, managing multiple vendors, paying two people out of two separate pockets is not something that any of us want to be doing in the long run. With that, thank you very much. And some final notes. First, Sprint on Sunday. Please join. I will not be here, unfortunately, but I do want to encourage all of you to come. It's always a good time. And finally, please let me know how you like this session. And if you want to send me an email or find me on Twitter, I'd be interested to hear about your feedback, what was missing. Obviously, demos were missing. I already know that. But if you want to email me with any feedback about the content, how this could be more helpful, any questions you might have, I'm very happy to answer those. Thank you very much. I'll take maybe 2 questions or 3 questions. I think I might be eating into the time of the next presenter, so I'll just okay, good. Yes?
Do you need to have those installations, distribution installations to run your Waterwheel SDK, or can I just run it on basic Drupal?
You can run it on basic Drupal. So actually, a lot of people that I've seen use Waterwheel.js on their Drupal sites to enrich their sort of user interfaces. So one use case I didn't talk about is, yeah, you might want to use it in Node.js, you might want to use it in React, but you might also just want to use it in Drupal in your jQuery to help kind of drive a lot of those dynamic updates of content that you might have.
So Drupal's the front end for your Drupal backend.
Yeah, exactly.
So Waterwheel, what if you have custom entities? Is it then you have to like adjust it?
So custom, yeah. So Waterwheel has the ability to, there's a populate resources and get resources method available in Waterwheel that allows you to define what those resources are. And this is actually really helpful for things like client-side validation, but the really custom entities is something that I'm actually not sure that I've actually played with in Waterwheel, but I'll let you know.
Okay.
Let me see what I can dig up there.
Because like I have Contrib Kanban, that's like a progressively decoupled app,
Yeah.
and I want to move it to making a Chrome extension actually that can work offline. So you can go to Drupal.org, see an issue, click subscribe, and I have node boards now, so you can actually like make a collection of issues you track, and then possibly like a tablet form to help sprinters, like a mentor at DrupalCon. You can walk around with a tablet. Here's our sprint board, and I want to try to make more like native things with like the Drupal back.
Are you planning to build that in React or?
It's React right now. So
Okay,
it's React
yes.
JS front end. I want to figure out how I can make the Chrome extension or anything else to omnichannel.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So Waterwheel.js fits React like a glove.
Okay.
However, custom entities, that's something I'll have to look into for you.
All right.
I think,
It's like I just don't want to do all the work.
I know.
And this sounds like it'd be
I know.
a great plugin.
yeah. I'm pretty sure, you know what, let me look that up right now, because that's, let me just look. It's been a while since I touched Waterwheel. So, I mean, assuming that,
Because I was wondering, like, is it as simple as in the array, like, can you just like plug in like
Yeah.
a pattern and it translates it to what REST API would expect?
it should, so here's the thing, I mean, there's this, right?
Okay.
Right, so this gets, so there's a new endpoint in OpenAPI now, which allows you to get every single available entity type
Okay.
with the bundle as well. So this might be your answer. Maybe. Try it.
I'll try
If
it.
it doesn't work, let me know. And I'll look into it for you.
Sweet.
Yeah.
This would be good.
Definitely. Yeah, we actually need to bring this up to date. But yeah, so, because the really cool thing about this, though, is that with that resource request, you get all the list of possible resources that are available, which should include custom entities. It definitely includes configuration entities, I'm pretty sure. And then, then you have the ability to basically do anything you want to, as long as you are aware of what the structure is.
Yeah.
So, one of the reasons I came to this session, a couple of them, just as a comment. I used to work for the New York State Senate, which was hosted on Acquia, and they have a CRM, Drupal, site that they use for constituent relationship management for all the senators. They were hoping they could host on Acquia. That was like, I don't know, 7-8 years ago. They've asked that we reached out to